about virtually everything, and invariably it was funny, but full of common sense. So Groucho Marx once said, I find television very educating. Every time somebody turns on the TV set, I go to the other room and read a book. Well, today we're going to look at various aspects of reading. Ravi, there is a disturbance. There's somebody talking.
Spencer.
Okay. Right.
Yeah,
okay.
muted.
Okay. Thank you. As I was saying, we're going to discuss several aspects of teaching reading. When I say several aspects, actually, I can identify 11 of them, but I'm obviously not going to be able to deal with all 11. And it would be unfair to try and talk about everything there is about reading in 60 or 70 minutes. It's unfair to the area, and it's unfair to you, because you shouldn't think that I've tried to encapsulate everything there is about reading in 60 minutes. Reading research is probably the most popular kind of research even today worldwide. So we'll be doing a disservice to them if we believe we've done it all at a small little webinar. Okay, what are the aspects of teaching silent reading, right? So what we're going to focus on today is silent reading, not reading aloud. So let me emphasize that. Aspects of teaching silent reading. What are these aspects? I'll run down the list. We're going to begin by looking at 2 cycles of reading. I'll show that to you in a moment. We're then going to ask the question, why should we learn to read at all? And try to answer that. Very importantly, we're trying to figure out, even now, as I speak, thousands of researchers worldwide are grappling with this question, what is reading? Related to that is a fundamental question of the role that background knowledge plays when we read. I'll come to that too in a few minutes' time. What is the relationship between reading purpose, the purpose for which we set out to read a text, and the kind of strategy we adopt to read that text? Question number 6. What are the different kinds of reading? So I'm going to list 4 kinds of reading a little later. And as part of that discussion on the kinds of reading, I'm going to show you how skimming and scanning can be used, skimming in particular. And at the core of it all, we're going to be looking at intensive reading, or what academics sometimes call study reading or reading for accuracy. And as part of that discussion, I'll obviously discuss comprehension questions, the levels of comprehension, and apply it to the text that we're going to look at later. And time permitting, I'll probably finish with the kind of guidance we should be providing to our learners before they actually start reading the text prescribed or unfamiliar text. We're not going to be able to look at uses of extensive reading, because that is a very important aspect of reading, and I think it requires a different session, an elaborate session on why we need extensive reading. And a very important part of studying reading is, how do we evaluate reading success? How do we test reading? Now that again is an area that we will not be able to address today, but inshallah, as they say, we'll do it someday. Okay. I said we're going to start with looking at aspects of silent reading. Now, I thought I should clarify that. Take a look at this slide now. The top half, you have reading aloud, and in the bottom half, you have silent reading, right? Now, look at reading aloud. There are three factors there: shape, sound, and sense, right? So the graphic bit of it is what we call shape, or spelling, if you want to call it. Sound is the pronunciation of the word, and sense is the meaning, right? Now, what happens? If you look at CAT as a learner in the initial years of learning English, and the learner is helped by the teacher to turn it into k, a, t, the phonic approach, and then say k, a, t, cat. Moment that happens, the sound and the shape together direct you to the real thing, a visualization of a cat, right? And some of the learners and some of you now probably have cats as pets. Right? What this also means is, when you're reading aloud, you have to actually enunciate every word in print. And therefore, it's going to take time to read something aloud, which normally should take maybe half the time if you were reading it silently. Because when you're reading something silently, you're just looking at the spelling, the shape, C-A-T, cat, and the moment as a trained reader, you know what cat is, the brain signals the picture to you, right? So it's important for us to move children from reading aloud to silent reading as soon as possible, and to make sure that some of the bad habits associated with trying to use shape and sound in order to make sense are diminished, in fact eradicated, when they come to pure silent reading. Now, this is not to say we don't have to read aloud. No, that's not what I'm saying. Yesterday, after all, I read 7 or 8 poems aloud to you. But most of the time, we are reading silently. So that clarification I thought was important. Now let's look at 2 cycles of reading. A negative cycle and a positive cycle. Let's first look at cycles of frustration and growth. Right? What does this mean? Look at this cycle. As a reader, if what you read you don't understand, you're going to read it again and again, perhaps. As a result, your reading speed is going to slow down. You're going to read slowly. Because you read what you're reading very slowly, you don't quite enjoy the act of reading. And as a result, you may go off reading altogether. It's happened to children. But those children who somehow manage to carry on don't really read very much because they're saying, what I read, I don't understand. And whatever I read very slowly, whereas my friend reads rapidly. And I don't quite enjoy reading what I do read. And therefore, I don't really want to read anything more. I'll read the very minimum. In a classroom, what this might mean is learners might restrict themselves to reading only the prescribed text. And that's what we call the vicious circle of the weak reader. There is some disturbance in the background, Ravi. Ravi, can you hear me? Yeah. Can you mute a couple of those phones, please?
Sir, I muted it, sir.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Right. Now let's look at a happy cycle, what we call the virtuous cycle of the good reader. Now, when you have a trained, experienced good reader, what he reads, he understands, right? Because he understands better than the weak reader, he actually enjoys the act of reading. And because he enjoys what he reads, the reading speed increases naturally, automatically sometimes. And because he reads faster and enjoys what he reads, he wants to read more. So he finishes one text and moves to another text. He finishes one book and moves to another book. And the more he reads, the greater the comprehension overall. And the greater the comprehension, the greater the enjoyment, and so on. So the cycle goes round and round happily for the good reader, the virtuous cycle of the good reader. Now, this is from a very good primer, if I might call it, on reading, a book written by Christine Nuttall, 2005. It's simply called Teaching Reading Skills in a Foreign Language, right? Lovely little book to get our teeth into what reading is all about. For other aspects of reading, deeper aspects, of course, there are hundreds and hundreds of sources. And we can have a discussion about that at a later point, not today, but when the need arises. Right. I'll stay with Nuttall and show you what she thinks is the aim of a reading development program. Now, what this means is when curriculum developers and syllabus designers sit together and put together a curriculum in English for schools, the SCRT might do it, the NCRT might do it, the CBSE might do it, EFLU might do it. When we attempt a syllabus in English, one of the core skills that we want to focus on, and invariably it's right at the top of the list, is reading. But what is it that we have in mind when we say our children must learn to read? Why is reading so important? As teachers, very often we don't ask this question because we're simply given a textbook and told, this is your textbook, this is your reader, interesting word. So go into the classroom and teach it. So the teacher very often doesn't know why it it is that the syllabus designer and the curriculum maker thought of reading in the first place. So Christine Nuttall says, the aim of a reading development program is to enable students to enjoy, or at least feel comfortable with, reading in English, and to read without help unfamiliar, authentic texts at appropriate speed, silently, and with adequate understanding. Now, as I was reading this statement, you must have noticed I was pausing at different points of that statement. Now, let me show you what those pauses are. Right? You see the forward slashes? I have converted Nuttall's statement into chunks. Now let's quickly look at each chunk. To enable students, the emphasis is on students, readers, learners. Now, why is that important? Very often in a classroom, the reader says, the teacher says or argues, this particular text is difficult for my students to read on their own. So I'll read it for them and explain it all. Think about that for a moment. As a caring teacher, I want to help my students. But the way I go about doing it is flawed. Reason? I'm not giving my learners a chance to read. I'm telling them, look, I'll read for you and I'll explain every sentence in this story. All that you have to do is to listen to me and you'll understand the story. As a net result, the student's reading ability is going to remain where it is, but my ability as a teacher is going to increase because I'm doing all the reading. I'm going to become a better reader. Now that's silly, isn't it? We're being paid to enable students to become readers, not to make ourselves better readers. So the emphasis there is on enabling students. Now, when they read, we're hoping that they will enjoy what they read in English. Now, that's a critical factor. Now, why is enjoyment and comfort levels important? Because if you remember the vicious circle, if you don't enjoy what you're reading, if you're not comfortable with what you're reading, you're going to read less and eventually you may stop reading. It also therefore points to a very important aspect of curriculum design and course design in general, which is to design teaching materials in reading which will lead to comfort levels, firstly, and hopefully enjoyment and pleasure. Which is why textbook writers like me take a long time putting textbooks together, reading text together, by checking with teachers, by checking with young people, checking with potential users to make sure that what finally goes into print will appeal to the majority of the learners. Now, what they read, this is after /2, they should be able to read without help, right? So who is a good teacher of reading? A good teacher of reading is somebody who will slowly withdraw her help over a period of time and enable her learners to reach a stage where they'll say, teacher, I think we can manage reading on our own now. Now that's exactly what's happened to you as adults. You don't need a teacher to help you reading. You've reached a stage of maturity in reading where you can read without a teacher's help, without external help. Now that's a name.
ट्रैफिक से डर के लग जाती खाई से चिंता को कार टू व्हीलर में गए तो झटक जाती हैं आप
Yeah.
कार पे गाँव
Yeah. Could you mute that, please? Right. Thank you. Right. Now, what should you be reading? Now, that's important. Of course, you should read the prescribed text. Of course, you should make sense of the workbook. Of course, you should make sense of the supplementary reader. But they are all directed at a test or a series of tests or an examination. What we should actually be aiming at is not just enabling our learners to do exceedingly well in an examination, but to be able to read something that they have never ever read before, but at the level of proficiency at which they are. So if they're able to read a story prescribed in the book, they should be able to read a story of comparable difficulty from a storybook. That's the aim of teaching reading. They cannot be confined to the textbook all their life. So it's important, therefore, to keep this in mind. Years ago, Professor Sashikumar and I were perhaps the first exam paper designers who thought of introducing unfamiliar text testing in a question paper. And I think we reserved 10 marks for it, 30 or 40 marks for understanding or proof of having understood the prescribed text. But we brought in this notion of unfamiliar text, and there was a mini uproar, right? Teachers who should have known better said, "Sir, 10 marks? What if they don't understand the text? They lose all 10 marks," right? So you see the fear that even experienced teachers have. They've missed the point that the aim of reading, teaching reading, is to enable learners in the long run to read well beyond what has been prescribed. And what is it they should be able to read? They should be able to read authentic texts, not just texts prescribed, but authentic texts like the newspaper, for instance. They should be able to read subtitles in a film that they're watching. They should be able to read the titles that go along with a news telecast, right? They should be able to pick up a magazine and read that magazine. If they are interested in sports writing, they should be able to go to the sports page of the Hindu, let's say, and read what a fine writer like Suresh has to say about Tendulkar and Gavaskar. And the same group of people, sports-minded learners, will want to read Sports Star, right? Now, that is authenticity. A simple definition of an authentic text is, a working definition, it's a text that was written originally for non-academic purposes, right? Nobody writes a text, a short story, hoping that it will get into Paul Gunashekar's textbook. Because the moment it comes into my textbook, I have destroyed its authenticity, right? Because I'm asking questions based on a text that you normally wouldn't otherwise. Would you go up to a person on the road and say, "Did you read the sports page in the Hindu?" And he says, "Yes." And would you then say to him, "I'm going to ask you a series of questions to find out if you have actually read that section"? Very unnatural, isn't it? So authenticity is important to the overall aim of a reading program. At what speed should we be reading? Very diplomatically, Christine Nuttall says, appropriate reading, appropriate speed. Now that's important. There are any number of books that train you to increase your reading speed. Now, why is reading speed important? As we said earlier in the session, the more you read, the faster the pace of reading will become, right? Uh, People used to say that John F. Kennedy could read in excess of 1,000 words in a minute, right? But remember, reading speed without understanding is useless. So which is why you read at a comfortable speed, and that speed enables you to understand what you have read and perhaps share what you have read with your teacher, with your peers, with your parents. And as we emphasized a little while earlier, we want to enable our students to read whatever they read silently, right? You'll notice there are adults, middle-aged people, even senior citizens who will pick up a newspaper and read it aloud, which means they are vocalizing, mouthing every word. And I'm not sure that by the time they come to the 10th word, they remember the first word. Because reading speed of that kind, mouthing everything, reading out as we call it, actually interferes with your understanding, right? So we better leave reading aloud to those aspects of the curriculum where reading aloud is necessary. And we'll also let people who need to read aloud to continue with their vocation, the newscasters, right? The ones who work on TV. Sometimes they're reading out to you. And a lot of the time, they're using the teleprompter in front of them to read fluently. Right? And finally, most importantly, what we read, we need to be able to understand at least adequately. You cannot hope that you can understand a text completely. And I'll show you in a moment why that is not desirable. In fact, not possible. Okay, let's move quickly to an important question. Why read? Two or three reasons why we should read. Perhaps you've thought about this, but it's worth going through it. Right. Firstly, reading is a means of extending our command of the language concerned. You may not have thought about this, but there is enough research evidence to show that those people who read more actually have a better command of the language concerned than those who read less or don't read at all. Somebody asked Shashi Tharoor, how is it you know so much English? Right? We're all amazed at the command you have over English. How did it all happen? And Tharoor simply said, I read, and read. Right? You may not know this, but when Tharoor was a young boy, he was asthmatic, right? We pronounce it asthma, asthmatic, right? And because he was asthmatic, he